The airport buzzed with the usual hum of travelers rushing to their gates, bags clattering on the tiled floor, and announcements echoing through the loudspeakers. In the midst of the chaos, Colonel Marcus Williams, a seasoned military general, walked through the terminal with the calm and composed presence of someone who had seen it all. His crisp uniform, decorated with badges and honors, reflected his status, but it was his quiet confidence that drew attention. He had just returned from an overseas mission, one that had taken months of planning, intense operations, and countless hours spent coordinating with other nations. His plane ride was meant to be the one peaceful reprieve from his demanding life. After spending hours in meetings and dealing with high-level negotiations, the thought of a long flight in the comfort of first class seemed like the perfect end to a taxing journey. As Marcus approached the boarding gate, the line stretched longer than expected. The agent at the counter, a young man in his mid-20s with a short-cropped haircut and a stern expression, glanced up at Marcus as he walked toward the podium. He paused, as though evaluating Marcus, but said nothing. The general smiled politely, not paying much attention to the momentary glance, and handed over his boarding pass. "Excuse me, sir," the agent said, his voice sharper than Marcus had anticipated. "This boarding pass is for business class. First class is over there." Marcus raised an eyebrow, confused. He had booked first class months ago, and there had been no mistake in the reservation. He was about to speak up when the agent held up his hand to stop him. "I understand, but we have a policy here. There is no way you can take that seat," the agent insisted, his tone becoming more dismissive. The young man glanced at Marcus' uniform again, but this time his eyes lingered on the dark color of Marcus's skin. "I'll just have to call someone to assist you. You can take your seat in business class." The general's heart skipped a beat. This was no simple mix-up. It was clear that the agent's refusal had nothing to do with Marcus's reservation and everything to do with the color of his skin. His instincts kicked in immediately, but he kept his voice steady, his gaze calm. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked quietly, his eyes narrowing slightly, locking onto the agent's. "I have my seat booked in first class, and I intend to take it." The agent's lips curled into a thin, almost smug smile. "As I said, sir, that's not possible." He glanced around, as if seeking some kind of validation for his actions. "We can't just let anyone sit there." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just a petty refusal. This was discrimination, blatant and unmistakable. But instead of reacting with anger, he leaned in, his voice smooth but firm. "I suggest you check the system again," Marcus said, his gaze never leaving the agent's. "It's not a mistake I intend to correct. But if you don't want to do your job, I'll take this up with someone who knows what they're doing." The agent seemed unbothered by Marcus's words, yet the tension in his body suggested he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The general's calm demeanor only seemed to rattle him further. The refusal wasn't going the way the agent had imagined. Marcus didn't wait for another response. He turned, making his way toward the lounge area, and reached for his phone. As he walked, he knew exactly what he had to do, but there was something more pressing now. He needed to figure out how he would handle the situation, not just as a military officer, but as a person who had fought for justice in many forms over the years. This moment wasn't just about him, it was about proving a point. The agent watched him walk away, his face tinged with uncertainty, but Marcus never looked back. As he sat down to make a few phone calls, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how many people had faced this same kind of blatant prejudice and injustice without the power to fight back. How many had walked away quietly, ashamed of the way they had been treated, unable to stand up for themselves? This agent had made a mistake, and Marcus would make sure he wouldn't be the last person to feel the sting of that kind of prejudice. But first, he would need to wait for the right moment. Marcus sat back in the lounge, his phone pressed to his ear as he made the necessary calls. His mind raced, piecing together the events of the last few minutes. The situation wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It wasn't even about a simple act of refusal. It was a stark reminder that, even in a society that claimed to have evolved, there were still those who believed their skin color gave them power over others. His mind briefly flickered back to his service, his years of dedication, the countless battles, and the respect he had earned. Marcus had faced adversity before, but it was always different when the enemy wore a smile and claimed innocence. He had no doubt that the agent, despite his actions, believed he was justified. It was how racism worked, subtle, disguised, and often dismissed as mere policy or the standard procedure. Marcus' thoughts were interrupted by the voice on the other end of the line. "Hello, General Williams," came the deep, familiar voice of his superior. "I understand there's been an issue with your seat assignment?" Marcus exhaled, gathering his thoughts. "That's one way to put it," he replied evenly. "I'm being denied a seat in first class, despite my reservation. I believe this is a case of discrimination, and I need your help." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of papers rustling. "Discrimination? What exactly happened?" "An agent at the gate refused to let me take my seat in first class, telling me that people like me that don't belong there," Marcus explained, his tone controlled but firm. "He didn't just make a mistake. This was deliberate." Another silence followed before the superior spoke again. "I'll handle it. Sit tight, General. I'll have the situation addressed immediately. Stay where you are, and I'll notify airport security and the airline management. You'll have a seat in first class within the hour." Marcus nodded even though his superior couldn't see it. "Thank you, sir." After hanging up, Marcus leaned back in the lounge chair, his eyes scanning the terminal. It wasn't lost on him that this would likely escalate. The agent had made a critical mistake, one that wasn't just about a flight. It would carry repercussions, ones that would send a message not only to the agent but to everyone who witnessed what had happened. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours as Marcus waited. He knew that it wasn't just the agent at fault. This kind of behavior was systemic, a reflection of something far deeper than the actions of a single person. He could already hear the whispers, people likely knew who he was by now. It wasn't every day a military general walked through the terminal, but Marcus had learned to expect whispers in every room he entered. The deeper problem was the way society had conditioned itself to accept such behavior without ever truly questioning it. He wasn't going to let this moment pass quietly. As Marcus sat there, his mind returned to a time earlier in his career when he had faced similar moments of systemic injustice, when his abilities, his service, and his humanity had been overlooked or undermined simply because of his race. He had learned early on that there was no room for passivity. Action was needed, always. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps broke his train of thought. A woman, a supervisor from the airline, appeared at the entrance to the lounge. Her expression was tense, but not unfriendly. "General Williams," she asked, her voice respectful but with a hint of nervousness. Marcus stood, adjusting his uniform, as he nodded. "Yes, that's me. I'm Sandra, I'm the supervisor on duty today." "I've been informed about the issue with your seat," she said, glancing around before continuing in a hushed tone. "I'm truly sorry for what happened. We are investigating the situation right now." "You should be," Marcus replied, his voice unwavering. "I'd like the agent who refused me to be brought in front of me." Sandra hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course, General. We're arranging that now. Please, follow me." As they walked together to the boarding area, Marcus felt the eyes of the other passengers on him, and though he tried to ignore them, he could feel their judgment, curiosity, and silent assessments. Some passengers glanced away quickly, embarrassed to be witnessing the scene. Others stared openly, unsure of what was happening but clearly sensing that something significant was unfolding. Marcus didn't care. He knew this wasn't about him anymore. This was about exposing the ugliness of racism in plain sight, in a place that was supposed to be neutral, a place where people were supposed to be treated with dignity. When they arrived at the gate, the agent was there, standing with his hands clasped behind his back. His demeanor was visibly uncomfortable, his usual smugness replaced by an awkward unease. "Mr. Richards," Sandra said coldly, "this is General Marcus Williams. He's been a guest of our airline for years, and you've treated him with disrespect. You'll explain your actions to him." The agent's face turned pale. He looked at Marcus, then back at Sandra, unsure how to proceed. But Marcus, always the calm in a storm, spoke first. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. The agent blinked, clearly caught off guard. I know you're a general, sir. But that doesn't matter. The policy is the policy." "Policy?" Marcus cut in, his tone hardening. "Let me tell you something about policies, Mr. Richards. They are meant to serve people, not to discriminate against them. And when you let your biases shape those policies, you are the one who needs to be held accountable. The room was silent now, every eye on Marcus, every ear tuned into his words. You're going to regret this moment, Mr. Richards, Marcus continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years of injustice. But the bigger question is, will you learn from it? The atmosphere at the gate had grown thick with tension. All eyes were on Marcus and the agent, who was visibly sweating now. The passengers, many of them still caught in their own conversations, were gradually becoming aware of the gravity of the situation. Sandra, the airline supervisor, stood quietly behind Marcus, her face a mixture of nervousness and resolve. General Williams, Sandra said, her voice barely above a whisper, if you'd like, we can make arrangements for another flight or give you a private space while we handle the situation. But you have to understand, this is something we need to address carefully. Marcus glanced over at her. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, but he knew this was much bigger than his own discomfort. He had worked long and hard to reach the position he was in, and he wasn't going to let some petty display of racism tarnish the work of generations before him. This wasn't about his flight, it was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. No, Marcus said, his tone firm. I'm not going anywhere. You're going to resolve this, right here, right now. The agent, Mr. Richards, stood frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. He had clearly expected the situation to blow over or to be dismissed without consequence. Now, it was clear that Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. The general stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. He had dealt with far more intimidating situations. And yet, this moment, this uncomfortable, everyday racism, was the one that truly hurt. It was insidious, and it was personal. Sandra cleared her throat. We'll be in touch with the airline management and airport security, she said, trying to reassure the passengers and bring some order to the growing chaos. Please remain calm. But Marcus could feel his blood boiling. How many times had he been in situations like this, where he was forced to keep his cool in the face of utter disrespect? How many times had he swallowed his pride and played by the rules, only to have people like Richards trample over everything he had worked for? Mr. Richards, Marcus said, his voice low and controlled. Do you understand what you've done? You've just humiliated me in front of dozens of people. But more than that, you've put yourself in a position where you will be held accountable. Your actions have consequences, and I will make sure you understand that. The agent's face turned from pale to red, and he stammered, struggling to find words. I didn't mean anything by it. His voice trailed off, his hands trembling. Sandra shot him a disapproving look. Mr. Richards, she began, her voice stern. This behavior is unacceptable. I'm going to have to report you to the higher authorities immediately. Please stand by. Marcus nodded slowly, a sense of finality in his actions. The agent was no longer a threat. The real work was about to begin. As Sandra walked off to call the necessary authorities, Marcus found himself alone with Richards. The agent shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his eyes, his shame palpable. For a moment, Marcus considered confronting him, but then he realized the agent wasn't the problem. He was merely a symptom of a much deeper issue. He had been standing on the front lines of that battle his entire life. He had fought for his country, for his people, and for justice. But this was something different. This wasn't a battlefield of bullets and explosions. This was the battlefield of respect, of dignity, and of self-worth. The weight of that realization hit him hard. The sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. It was his superior from earlier, the one who had promised to take action. General Williams, the voice on the other end began. We've made contact with the airline's upper management and their legal team. They've already launched an internal investigation. We are also coordinating with airport security and local authorities. We're not going to let this slip. Marcus breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't over yet, but he could feel the momentum shifting in his favor. There was power in his position. Yes, but there was also power in the truth. And today, the truth was on his side. I appreciate that, Marcus replied, but this isn't just about policy. This is about the impact it has on people like me. People who have fought, who have worked, and who deserve respect. I won't back down from this. Understood, General. We're with you. Let's get this resolved. Marcus ended the call, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps. He needed to be strategic. If he wanted this to make a difference, he had to ensure that this incident wasn't swept under the rug. It had to be a public moment, something that made people take a hard look at the underlying issues of race and power in this country. Richards, still standing awkwardly nearby, fidgeted with his hands. Marcus turned to him one last time. "You know," Marcus said, his voice softening just a touch, "you could have done things differently. You could have treated me like a person, not a stereotype, but you chose not to, and now you'll have to deal with the consequences." Richards opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His eyes were wide with fear, and Marcus could see that he understood this wasn't going to blow over. This would follow him. People like him didn't just disappear into the crowd. They were held accountable, and Marcus would make sure of it. As Sandra returned to the gate, the agent was told to report to a back office, and airport security was notified of the situation. Marcus, on the other hand, had made his mark. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane anymore, it was about showing everyone, whether they were watching or not, that discrimination would never be allowed to stand unchallenged. Marcus sat quietly in a back office, a cup of lukewarm coffee in front of him, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. The events of the past few hours replayed in his mind. Every word he had said to the airline agent, every decision he had made, had been a calculated step to expose the layers of institutional racism that still existed, even in the seemingly benign spaces like an airport terminal. The door opened with a soft creak, and Sandra walked in, her expression grave but resolute. Behind her, a tall, well-dressed man in a dark suit entered. His demeanor was professional, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed a sense of urgency. This was the airline's legal representative, someone who had likely been briefed on the situation and now had to deal with the fallout. "General Williams," Sandra began, "this is Mr. Caldwell, our legal counsel. He's here to discuss the situation with you and ensure we take the appropriate steps moving forward." Marcus nodded, setting down his coffee cup. He could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what was about to unfold. He had no intentions of letting anyone sweep this under the rug. What had happened today wasn't a one-off incident. It was part of a larger pattern that needed to be addressed. "Mr. Caldwell," Marcus said, standing up and extending his hand, "I hope we can come to a resolution that ensures this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone." Caldwell shook his hand firmly, his gaze steady. "We understand, General. We've already launched an internal investigation, and we're taking this matter very seriously. The behavior of Mr. Richards was unacceptable, and we're looking into the full extent of his actions, including whether there were any previous complaints or patterns of discrimination." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I hope you're not just paying lip service to the situation, Mr. Caldwell. This needs to be more than just an internal review. I want accountability, and I want transparency. If we are truly going to make any headway, we need to do more than just fire one agent and move on." Caldwell glanced at Sandra, who nodded in agreement. "We're prepared to do more than just investigate. We'll work with external agencies, and we will be transparent in our findings. But we also need your cooperation in this process, General." Marcus sat back down, his mind spinning with the options before him. The conversation was shifting into higher stakes now. He wasn't just dealing with an agent who had made a bad decision. He was dealing with a system that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. He wasn't about to let that slide. "I don't want any half measures," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "I want to see this through, every step of the way. We need to change the culture that allowed this to happen. It's not just about me getting an apology from the airline or a personal seat upgrade. This is about changing how people in positions of power treat others, especially when it comes to race." Sandra leaned forward, her voice serious. "We understand, General. That's why we're already working on a public statement, one that addresses the incident and outlines our commitment to fighting discrimination in all forms. We're also looking into implementing further training for all of our staff, from ground agents to flight attendants, to ensure this doesn't happen again." Marcus nodded, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. The public statement and training programs were important, yes, but they wouldn't fix the problem overnight. This needed to be part of a broader push to challenge systemic racism, to put pressure on institutions that still allowed this kind of behavior to fester. "I want to be involved in those efforts," Marcus said. "If you're serious about change, I'll help make sure this issue isn't buried. We need to create lasting accountability. We need to make sure every person who walks into one of your terminals knows that they will be treated with dignity and respect, no matter their skin color, gender, or background." Caldwell nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Of course, General, we would be honored to have your insight as we move forward. We need people like you, with real experience and credibility, to help us make lasting changes." the conversation continued for another half hour, as they discussed the logistics of the investigation and what steps would be taken next. Sandra and Caldwell were cooperative, but Marcus knew that even their best efforts might not be enough to affect the kind of change he was looking for. Change, after all, was never easy, and it required a combination of pressure, persistence, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Finally, as the meeting came to a close, Marcus stood up and extended his hand to both of them. "I appreciate your time today," he said, "but let me be clear, this is only the beginning. I'll be keeping an eye on this situation, and I expect to see real action, not just promises." As they shook hands, Marcus felt a slight sense of satisfaction, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this battle was far from over. The road ahead would be long and filled with resistance from those who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. But Marcus was ready. He had fought bigger battles before, and he wouldn't back down now. As he walked out of the office and back toward the gate, Marcus knew that this moment would echo far beyond this airport. What had started as an insult over a first-class seat had become something much larger. It was a fight for fairness, for justice, and for a society that was finally ready to face its most uncomfortable truths. He was determined to see it through to the end. The days following the incident were a whirlwind. News outlets, both local and national, had caught wind of the confrontation at the airport. The story was picked up across social media, with people from all walks of life expressing their outrage over the blatant racism Marcus had encountered. Some supported him, praising his calm and dignified response to the humiliating situation, while others questioned the severity of his reaction. But Marcus wasn't concerned with the detractors. His focus was on the long-term impact. It was late afternoon when Marcus received the call he had been expecting. Sandra's voice came through the phone, steady and professional, but there was a hint of relief in her tone. "General Williams, I wanted to update you. We've completed the initial internal review, and we've made the decision to part ways with Mr. Richards. His actions were entirely inconsistent with the standards we expect from our staff. In addition to that, we're going to move forward with the external audits we discussed. We've already reached out to diversity consultants who will help us reshape our training program from the ground up." Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the conversation sinking in. He had pushed for accountability, and it was beginning to happen. The agent, the symbol of the problem, would no longer work for the airline. But was that enough? "Good," Marcus replied, his voice quiet, "but it's important that this doesn't become just another empty gesture. The culture of discrimination is still alive and well, and firing one employee doesn't solve the larger issue." Sandra hesitated for a moment before responding. "I understand your concern, General. That's why we're also committing to making long-term changes. In addition to the external audits and training, we're going to publicly release our findings from the investigation. We want to be transparent about the steps we're taking and the work that still needs to be done. We'll also be partnering with organizations that are focused on promoting diversity and inclusion, both in the workplace and in the travel industry." Marcus nodded, though he still wasn't fully convinced. Words were powerful, but action spoke louder. He had seen too many well-intentioned companies fall short of real change. But Sandra's tone was different this time. She wasn't just placating him. She sounded determined, as if she was genuinely committed to the work ahead. "I appreciate that," Marcus said, "but remember, the pressure doesn't stop here. I'll be watching, and I'll be sure to hold you to your word. There are a lot of people out there who will be watching too. The airline industry as a whole needs to take a hard look at itself and change. This is about more than just your company. It's about how we, as a society, treat people of color in spaces that should be neutral, like airports." Sandra was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was tinged with a sense of purpose. "I completely agree. We'll be doing the work. General, thank you for your patience." Marcus hung up the phone, leaning back in his chair. His mind raced as he thought about the larger picture. This fight had just begun. One victory, no matter how satisfying, wasn't enough to dismantle the deeply entrenched systems of racism that existed in places of power, in corporations, and in the hearts of everyday people. But he had taken the first step, and that was something. Later that evening, Marcus appeared on a major news network to discuss the incident. The anchor introduced him as a decorated military officer. But today, he was not just a general, he was an advocate for justice. "Thank you for being with us, General Williams," the anchor said. "The incident you experienced at the airport has sparked a nationwide conversation about race and discrimination. What message do you hope people take away from this?" Marcus looked directly into the camera, his voice calm but resolute. "The message is simple," he began. Racism, in any form, is unacceptable. We can no longer stand idly by when people are treated as less than because of their skin color. It's not enough to be non-racist. We have to be actively anti-racist. We need to challenge these systems, not just within the walls of an airport, but everywhere we go, in the workplace, in schools, in government, in every aspect of society. The anchor nodded. And do you think we're making progress? We've made some progress, Marcus replied, but not nearly enough. The real work begins when we start confronting these issues. Even when it's uncomfortable, change doesn't happen overnight, but if we stay committed, we can make a difference. The interview continued, but Marcus's words had already made an impact. He could feel it in the responses pouring in from social media, in the conversations happening at dinner tables across the country. People were listening, and they were starting to understand. By the time Marcus boarded his rescheduled flight to Washington, D.C., a few days later, the story had become a symbol of something larger than just his personal experience. It was a moment in time when one man's refusal to accept discrimination forced an entire system to take a hard look at itself. As he settled into his seat, now in first class, he glanced out the window at the sprawling city below. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity, he was fighting for a future where no one would ever have to endure the kind of humiliation he had faced that day. And though the battle was far from over, Marcus knew one thing for sure: he would never stop fighting. Because change, as difficult as it was possible. And it started with him.